The ancient heart of the Appalachian Mountains beats with a wild, untamed beauty. Endless emerald hills roll like colossal waves towards a horizon kissed by the clouds, crisscrossed by trails that snake through forests where the only sound is the whisper of ages past. It is a silence so profound it feels untouched by the very hand of time. Yet, in the summer of 2012, this same pristine wilderness, often a balm for the weary soul, became the ominous backdrop for a chilling, unfathomable mystery. Brianna, a devoted mother of 46, and her vibrant 18-year-old son, Dylan, embarked on what should have been a simple, soul-restoring family trip. One morning, the air was light with their laughter, filled with shared plans for their return home. By nightfall, they had vanished. Swallowed by the vast, indifferent landscape, they simply ceased to be, leaving no trace, no whisper of their fate. For 3 agonizing years, their family endured a living nightmare. They searched, they prayed, they clung to slivers of hope, while simultaneously fearing the darkest truths. Until, that is, a discovery so shocking, so utterly horrifying, ripped through their world, exposing a grim secret meticulously sealed away in cold concrete. The Appalachian Mountains in that fateful summer of 2012 unfolded in an endless tapestry of green. Their quiet trails in the hushed, whispering forests held secrets far older than any human memory. Yet, soon, they would bear witness to new, terrible ones. For Brianna, a single mother at 46, this journey was intended as an escape, a much-needed reprieve, a chance to soothe her frayed mind, and most importantly, to reconnect with her only son, Dylan, who had just crossed the threshold into adulthood at 18. Life, in the preceding years, had been a relentless current pulling her under. The bitter currents of a divorce from a respected yet emotionally sterile lawyer had left her spirit parched. Now, with Dylan poised to step fully into his own life, she found herself clutching desperately to these dwindling moments of shared intimacy. They had rented a rustic cabin, a cozy wooden haven nestled deep within one of Appalachia's less trodden, forgotten valleys. With them were her sister, her brother-in-law, and their 2 children, a small, loving clan seeking solace in nature's embrace. The first 2 days unfolded like a dream, mornings brimming with sun-dappled hikes beneath ancient canopies, afternoons punctuated by the easy rhythm of laughter, and evenings warmed by crackling campfire stories under a blanket of stars. But then, an unexpected shadow fell. An urgent family emergency back home forced her sister's family to depart abruptly, cutting their retreat short. They packed in a flurry, rushing away before the peace of the trip could fully settle. Brianna, ever resilient, insisted that she and Dylan would remain. "We'll make the most of it," she reassured her worried sister, her voice a brave front against the sudden solitude. She wanted to believe it, to wring every last drop of joy from their time together, oblivious to the monstrous shadow that already stretched across their path.
3 more days won't hurt, Brianna had insisted, a plea tinged with desperation. Dylan needs this. And so, for mother and son, those extended days became a precious gift, a rare and fragile closeness. They walked the winding trails until their muscles ached, cooked simple meals over a sputtering flame, and shared quiet, meandering conversations about Dylan's future, a future still shimmering with the uncertain promise of youth. On the final morning of their stay, the 5th day, the plan was almost ritualistic in its simplicity. Check out by 4 in the afternoon, load the car, and begin the long drive back to the city's embrace. At 9 o'clock that morning, Brianna attempted to call her sister. The phone chimed, a repetitive, unanswered song, echoing into the empty air. Brianna left it at that. A few hours later, at noon, She sent a voice message through WhatsApp, her tone light, almost dismissive of the impending departure. "We'll be leaving around 4. Call me when you can." It was, unknowingly, the final reverberation of her voice her family would ever hear. On the other side of the mountain, her sister saw the missed calls and the voice note. But life, in its relentless demand, distracted her. Children clamored for attention, and the lingering anxiety from the emergency that had pulled her home early still buzzed beneath her skin. At first, she dismissed it. Brianna and Dylan, no doubt, were out there somewhere amidst the whispering pines, soaking in the last vestiges of mountain air before surrendering to the relentless grind of everyday life. Yet, within a mere 30 minutes, a subtle, cold tendril of unease began to snake its way around her heart. The silence now felt different, unnatural. She dialed Brianna's number again. No answer. Again. Nothing but the hollow ring. With each unanswered call, the anxiety sharpened, morphing into a piercing dread. For nearly an hour straight, she called, pacing her living room, a frantic animal trapped in a cage of possibilities. Lost signal, maybe? Battery dead? Driving through a dead zone? But then the line went dead entirely. The phone, once a lifeline, simply powered off. By 4 o'clock, the precise hour Brianna had promised to leave, her sister was no longer merely uneasy, she was frantic. She waited, eyes glued to her phone, willing it to light up with a call, a text, anything to banish the growing shadow. The hours dragged, heavy and thick with unspoken fear, but the phone remained stubbornly, chillingly silent.
At the first blush of dawn the following morning, the unbearable weight of silence drove her back to the cabin. The rising sun, usually a symbol of hope, did little to dispel the chill that gripped her as she stepped inside. What she found there made her blood run cold, freezing in her veins. Brianna and Dylan's luggage, untouched, lay slumped in a corner as if their departure had never even been conceived. A few bags sat idly, half-packed. Their phones, however, were gone. The car vanished. The beds bore the hasty imprints of sleep, blankets rumpled and askew, but nothing in the desolate cabin explained their sudden, complete absence. It was as if they had simply evaporated. Panic, a cold, sharp blade, pierced through her. She immediately called the local police, her voice trembling with the certainty that something was terribly, terribly wrong. She pleaded with them, insisted they trace Brianna's phone. Within hours, technicians began their work, pinpointing the last known IP address. But the trail was maddeningly obscure, unhelpful in its bizarre meanderings. Signals bounced erratically across remote valleys, pointing to isolated, uninhabited areas, places with no roads, no cabins, no conceivable human activity. To the sister, it felt terrifyingly clear. Brianna and Dylan had been swallowed whole, consumed by the very mountains they had come to find peace in. Fear, raw and primal, swiftly curdled into suspicion. Her mind, relentless, returned again and again to Brianna's ex-husband. A man of polished reputation, a lawyer, yet in her heart she knew him capable of a chilling cruelty. He hated her, she told investigators, her voice laced with venom. He wanted to control her. You have to look at him.
Serious, immersive narrator, moderate pacing, slight tonal shifts for characters, softer for women, fragile for children, firm for men. The police, acknowledging the urgency, agreed to pursue this lead. They questioned him meticulously, scrutinized his alibi, thoroughly searched his home and office. Yet, painstakingly, they found nothing not a single thread to tie him to the baffling disappearance. The case, almost as quickly as it began, started to lose its grip, the possibilities thinning out like the morning mountain fog that dissipates with the rising sun, leaving behind only vast, empty space. When Brianna and Dylan failed to return home, the days that followed blurred into a horrifying haze of panic and disbelief. For Brianna's sister, the silence became a suffocating weight. She called every hospital, every police station, every friend of Dylan she could think of, but no one had seen or heard a whisper from them. The official missing persons report was filed, and within hours, the calm of the Appalachians was shattered by the organized urgency of search teams, combing the wilderness near the cabin, looking for ghosts where only silence reigned.
Officers, their flashlights piercing the pre-dawn gloom, scoured the trails, their beams dancing over gnarled roots and damp earth. Dogs, their keen senses sharpened by training, sniffed diligently through the dense underbrush. Overhead, helicopters beat a relentless rhythm, their blades chopping through the still mountain air, a mechanical pulse against the ancient quiet. Yet there were no signs, no telltale footprints leading off into the deep woods, no abandoned vehicle by a desolate roadside. No dropped belongings, no torn fabric, no forgotten trace along the winding paths. It was as if mother and son had been simply, utterly plucked from the face of the earth. Investigators, grasping for any tangible lead, began with the most logical step: phone records. Brianna's WhatsApp voice message to her sister, sent at noon, remained the last verifiable whisper of their existence. After that, calls plunged into the void, unanswered, and the devices themselves went dark. When police finally attempted to trace the phones, the results were not just inconclusive, they were baffling. The last known pings ricocheted through rural cell towers, spitting out scattered, unhelpful coordinates deep within the impenetrable mountain valleys. The data tantalizingly suggested movement, yet no one could confirm how or why. These were remote, desolate areas, devoid of any nearby cabins or campsites. Nevertheless, searchers, fueled by desperation, drove to those coordinates, hacking through tangled brush and treacherous swamps, only to find nothing but an endless sea of trees and an unnerving silence. It was an invisible trail, mocking and forever just out of reach. With the terrain yielding no clues, suspicion, a natural predator of the unknown, inevitably turned towards Brianna's personal life. Investigators spoke with her sister, who, consumed by a fierce certainty, immediately pointed a trembling finger at one man, Brianna's ex-husband. He was a prominent lawyer, wealthy and outwardly respected, but their marriage had dissolved in a maelstrom of bitterness. He had fought her fiercely in court, publicly belittled her in front of her friends, and harbored a seething resentment over her custody of Dylan. To her sister, the motive was glaringly obvious. He hated her, she insisted, her voice raw with grief and conviction. He wanted control. Who else could have done this? Police brought the ex-husband in for questioning. He was calm, perhaps unnervingly so, and his alibi was meticulously airtight. He had been in court, surrounded by multiple witnesses, on the very day Brianna and Dylan vanished. His tone was cold, almost dismissive, as he told detectives, "I may have hated my ex-wife, but I'm not a murderer." Still, investigators, leaving no stone unturned, meticulously searched his home, his car, his office. They combed through his phone records, scrutinized his financial transactions, reviewed his client meetings. Not a single trace of a connection to the disappearance surfaced. Every theory the sister clung to unraveled under the harsh light of scrutiny.
Reluctantly, the investigators began the process of clearing him as a suspect. The family's frustration mounted, a suffocating burden as weeks bled into agonizing months. Without suspects, without evidence, the case began to lose its fragile traction. Posters bearing Brianna and Dylan's smiling faces appeared across Appalachian towns, two beaming portraits above the stark, haunting word missing. Candlelight vigils flickered in the encroaching darkness. Volunteers, armed with sticks and flashlights, combed through valleys, their hopes dwindling with each fruitless search. News crews reported on the disappearance, dubbing it the Appalachian Mystery. But as seasons changed and no new evidence surfaced, media attention, ever fickle, shifted elsewhere, leaving the family behind in a desolate landscape of unanswered questions. The sister, however, refused to surrender. She relentlessly pressed the police to pursue other leads, demanding updates, pestering detectives with her myriad theories. Each time she mentioned the puzzling phone traces, she was met with the same weary refrain. The data was inconclusive. It led nowhere. Yet, deep down, a stubborn instinct gnawed at her. She felt, with every fiber of her being, that there was something there, something vital, something criminally overlooked. The phones, she believed, had to mean something.
Meanwhile, in the small, insular communities nestled in the shadow of the mountains, whispers began to weave their own narratives. Some locals, quick to judge, speculated that Brianna and Dylan had simply run away, fleeing unspoken debts or hidden secrets. Others, steeped in local lore, claimed the ancient woods were cursed, a ravenous maw that swallowed hikers who dared to stray too far from the marked paths. A few, desperate for a less sinister explanation, suggested wild animals, though the utter lack of remains or even a single sign of struggle made such a theory improbable, almost absurd. None of it brought the family an ounce of peace. Detectives, stretching their dwindling resources, briefly chased other, fainter angles. A shadowy drifter reportedly spotted near the cabin, a vague report of suspicious men in a nondescript pickup truck, a fleeting rumor of someone attempting to pawn Brianna's distinctive jewelry in a neighboring county. Each fragile thread, however, unraveled into nothing. A mistaken identity, an unverified claim, or another frustrating dead end. The investigation became a patchwork of false starts, wasted man-hours, and a gnawing, soul-sapping frustration. By the 1-year mark, the search had slowed to a disheartening trickle. Officially, Brianna and Dylan remained listed as missing persons, but without any concrete evidence of foul play, the case began to gather dust, receding into the cold files of unsolved mysteries. For the family, this silence was infinitely worse than any bad news. It was an endless, torturous purgatory. Brianna's sister described it as living with a wound that never heals because no one can tell you what cut you. Yet beneath the quiet despair, shadows of unease stubbornly remained within the minds of the investigators. They couldn't explain why no personal belongings, no wallet, no watch, no spare clothing had ever surfaced. They couldn't rationalize why both phones had gone dead at nearly the exact same moment. And they certainly couldn't ignore the unsettling fact that other disappearances, though not directly linked, had occurred in the very same region. It was this potent mixture of lingering silence and gnawing suspicion that defined the second agonizing act of the case. The world, indifferent and relentless, moved on. The candlelight vigils, once numerous, grew smaller, their flames flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness. But the central mystery only deepened, solidifying into an unyielding enigma. Somewhere out there, Brianna and Dylan were gone. And whether they had been swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness or by the cruel, calculated hands of another human, no one knew. The sister's gut instinct, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, told her the truth was far darker than anyone dared to admit. She prayed, with a fervent, desperate hope, that someday, somehow, the mountains would finally surrender their terrible secret. 3 long, agonizing years had crawled by since Brianna and Dylan vanished into the heart of those mountains. For their family, time had not dulled the wound, it had only deepened it, festering with each passing day. Hope had become a cruel, cyclical torment. Every time the phone rang, every time the news reported on a body found in the sprawling region, her sister's heart would lurch with a terrifying mix of terror and anticipation, only to crash down again into the familiar abyss of despair. The faces of Brianna and Dylan still hung on faded posters along forgotten roadsides, though most passerbys no longer even notice their smiling, ghostly visages. The case was undeniably cold. Life in its relentless march seemed to have forgotten them entirely. But in the sweltering summer of 2015, a phone call shattered that agonizing stasis. It changed everything. Workers at a remote construction site on the very edge of a small Appalachian town had been tasked with a seemingly routine job, clearing an old sealed septic chamber buried deep beneath layers of cracked concrete. It was meant to be simple maintenance, a straightforward task to prepare the land for a new project. But when the chamber was finally broken open, the stench that poured out was not merely overwhelming. It was an infernal, suffocating wave of decay, trapped and concentrated for years. To their horror, amidst the putrid darkness, the workers discovered 2 human bodies, tangled and horribly decomposed, wrapped in the disintegrating remnants of clothing and surrounded by decayed personal belongings. Panic, a visceral, sickening wave ripped through the site. Within an hour, police had cordoned off the entire area, their expressions grim, their silence heavy with unspoken dread.
At first, investigators believed the remains might belong to a different missing couple who had vanished months earlier. The size and positioning seemed to fit the profile. A man and a woman, possibly victims of some local predator or criminal act. Calls were made to that other couple's relatives, and for a brief, excruciating moment, another family thought their own nightmare might finally find its ending. But when forensic teams, methodical and grim, began their meticulous work, the true, horrifying identity began to emerge. DNA tests, painstakingly cross-referenced against national missing persons databases, revealed what Brianna's sister had both dreaded and, in her deepest heart, expected for years. The bodies were Brianna and Dylan. The news shattered her world into a million irreparable pieces. When the police called to deliver the confirmation, her knees buckled and the phone slipped from her numb fingers, clattering to the floor. She had braced herself for this moment countless times, imagining it in the suffocating darkness of sleepless nights. But hearing the words spoken aloud was like being cut open anew, a fresh, searing wound. It's them. We found them. There was no more hope. The 2 people she loved most had not walked away. They had not vanished into benign mystery. They had been taken, hidden, discarded. The horrific discovery reignited the cold case with a terrible blazing urgency, and with it came a fresh, ravenous swarm of media attention.
Reporters, a renewed frenzy in their movements, swarmed back to the mountains. their cameras filming the excavation site where the septic chamber had been brutally unearthed. They speculated wildly about the unspeakable horrors that must have unfolded within that sealed concrete tomb. The local community, once steeped in hushed rumors, was utterly stunned. Neighbors who had idly believed Brianna and Dylan had merely wandered too far into the vast wilderness now confronted a far darker, more sinister reality. The discovery of the chamber itself, sealed tight, deliberately concealed, a monument to hidden depravity, was undeniable proof. This was no accident, no tragic misstep into the wild. This was no simple disappearance. Someone had put them there. Someone had intended for them to remain buried, silenced, and forgotten forever. For the investigators, the case was no longer a mystery of if something terrible had happened, but a chilling, relentless quest for who. How had Brianna and Dylan ended up in that horrific chamber? Who had sealed them inside? And perhaps most crucially, why? Early evidence collected from the scene hinted strongly at robbery. Bags lay with the remains, but valuables, including the elusive phones, were conspicuously missing. It was a chilling, fragmented glimpse into their final, terrifying hours, but still it yielded no immediate answers. For Brianna's sister, grief, a raw, gaping wound, now intertwined with a searing fury. She stood at the edge of the excavation site, her gaze fixed on the earth that so cruelly concealed her beloved sister and nephew for 3 interminable years. The mountains had finally, agonizingly, given up their secret. But it was not an act of mercy. It was a wound brutally reopened, bleeding anew. She made a silent, unshakable promise to herself. She would not, could not stop until she knew the truth. Someone had stolen them. Someone had silenced them. And now, at long last, there was a chance, a desperate, fragile chance to find out who. The grotesque discovery of Brianna and Dylan's bodies reignited a blazing fire beneath the cold, forgotten case. Detectives who had long since filed the mystery away now worked around the clock, fueled by a grim determination. For 3 years, theories had swirled like mountain fog, obscuring the truth. But the sealed septic chamber was undeniable, irrefutable proof. This was deliberate. This was calculated. This was cruel beyond measure. Their deaths had not been an accident of nature, not some tragic twist of fate, but a heinous crime committed by human hands. Still, the fundamental, agonizing question remained: whose hands?
The investigation turned back, painstakingly, to the smallest pieces of evidence, re-examining every overlooked clue with fresh, desperate eyes. Brianna's sister, still haunted by a corrosive mix of guilt and suspicion, pushed the police relentlessly. Her voice, often cracked and raw with frustration during meetings, became the persistent, unwavering thread that finally began to unravel the tangled skein of the case. "Check the phones again," she begged, her voice rising with desperate urgency. "Someone had them. Someone used them. Don't tell me they just disappeared into the mountains. Trace them!" At first, the police were hesitant, almost dismissive. They had combed through cell tower data years earlier and found nothing solid, nothing actionable. But with the unequivocal proof of foul play offered by the chamber discovery, they agreed to try again. This time, however, advances in digital forensics, coupled with new data sharing agreements between agencies, provided investigators with tools they simply hadn't possessed in 2012. digging through old logs, reinterpreting obscure pings, and cross-referencing information with a newfound precision, analysts began to notice irregularities, strange, almost imperceptible patterns. The invisible trail, once tauntingly out of reach, was finally beginning to reveal itself.
After the phones had abruptly gone dark near the cabin, a ghost of his signal, brief and fleeting, flickered back to life, days later. In a different county, far from the original search area, far from the familiar routes. This faint digital heartbeat led them towards a forgotten rural valley, a landscape dotted with decrepit farmhouses and properties left half abandoned, places that rarely, if ever, drew attention from the outside world. Detectives, clutching this slender thread of a lead, followed it into the quiet desolation, eventually staking out one crumbling property in particular, a sagging farmhouse with rusted, decaying machinery scattered across its overgrown yard. At first glance, it seemed utterly unremarkable, another forgotten testament to time's relentless march. But the longer they watched, the stranger, the more unsettling it became. Men came and went at odd, clandestine hours, always cautious, always casting wary glances into the shadows. Vehicles bearing out-of-state license plates appeared and vanished with unsettling regularity. Neighbors, when pressed, whispered nervously about rough types staying there. But no one dared speak too loudly, their words swallowed by fear. With a warrant finally secured, the police moved in. What they uncovered was darker, more twisted than even their seasoned imaginations had conjured. Inside, amidst the squalor, they found an arsenal of weapons, a hoard of stolen property, and undeniable evidence of a sophisticated, ruthless, organized crime operation. But the most shocking discovery was not material, it was profoundly, heartbreakingly human. Locked away in a suffocating back room, malnourished and trembling with terror, was a couple who had been reported missing months earlier. They were alive, barely, trembling and weak from their ordeal, a nightmare of captivity that had stolen their freedom and nearly their lives. The rescue of this couple transformed the cold case from a lingering mystery into a sprawling, horrifying criminal conspiracy.
Under intense interrogation, fragments of the brutal truth began to surface, pieced together from fractured confessions and terrified whispers. The decrepit property, it turned out, was a hub for a ruthless gang calling themselves the Colo Kings. A small but vicious crew of 4 men, 2 from Mexico, 1 from Venezuela, and 1 a local American drifter, a shadow of a man. Their crimes spanned a terrifying spectrum: robbery, extortion, and abductions. They had managed to remain chillingly under the radar by ensuring their victims remained silent, either through abject fear or through permanent disappearance. Brianna and Dylan, investigators painstakingly pieced together, had been among their earliest Appalachian victims. The rescued couple, still raw from their own captivity, described overhearing chilling conversations among the gang members. They spoke coldly, with callous indifference, of the mother and the boy who had fought back, who had refused to surrender their valuables, their phones, their jewelry. A locket, one of them had boasted, worth thousands. In the brutal, desperate struggle, both Brianna and Dylan had been struck down. Their deaths, the gang claimed, with cold calculation, had been accidental, but undeniably brutal.
Fearful of the inevitable police attention their gruesome act would draw, the gang had callously sealed Brianna and Dylan's bodies within the cold, dark confines of the septic chamber, convinced that their secret would remain forever buried. For Brianna's sister, the horrifying revelations brought a devastating, gut-wrenching pain, yet also a fierce, albeit bleak, vindication. She had been right to demand more, right to trust her intuition that the phones held the key. Now, at last, there were names, faces, a tangible enemy to confront. But the knowledge that her beloved sister and nephew had died over mere jewelry and electronics, murdered for the simple act of resisting theft, was a burden almost unbearable to carry. The police, galvanized by the breakthrough, launched a swift, multi-state operation to capture the Colo Kings. Over the following weeks, raids swept across hidden properties and various safe houses. One by one, the men were cornered. Some attempted desperate flights, others fought with savage abandon, but the relentless weight of law enforcement bore down. In the end, all four were captured, shackled, and dragged into custody. The case that had once seemed utterly hopeless was finally breaking wide open. What had begun as a baffling disappearance in the mountains had unfolded into a chilling saga of organized crime, profound cruelty, and incredible survival. But for the family, the fragile relief of having answers was inextricably bound to the agonizing pain of knowing the brutal truth. The Colo Kings were responsible, and justice, a distant, longed-for light, was finally within reach. Yet justice, no matter how complete, could never bring Brianna and Dylan back. The arrests of the Colo Kings sent shockwaves through the quiet Appalachian communities. For years, whispers of disappearances and strange, unsettling crimes had drifted through the valleys, often dismissed as mere rumor or the paranoia of isolated folk. But now, with the vicious gang exposed, the grim truth could no longer be ignored. The capture of the four men was splashed across local and national news outlets. "Gang behind Appalachian disappearances arrested," read one stark headline. For the first time since 2012, Brianna and Dylan's names returned to the front pages, not as missing persons, but as tragic victims whose case had, at long last, been solved.
For Brianna's sister, the news brought a tumultuous swirl of mixed emotions. The profound relief that their killers were finally caught mingled with a bitter, searing regret. The knowledge that this discovery had come too late to save her loved ones. In the quiet solitude of her home, she sat amidst old photographs spread across the table. Brianna smiling brightly at a family barbecue, Dylan holding his diploma, their faces frozen in moments of pure, unadulterated joy. She whispered to them, as if they could still hear her, her voice thick with emotion. "They can't hurt you anymore. I promise. I'll see this through. I'll be your voice now." The legal proceedings began swiftly, relentlessly. Prosecutors charged the four men with multiple, heinous counts: murder, kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, robbery, and the desecration and concealment of human remains. Each man was held without bail, their faces grim and hardened as they were paraded into courtrooms overflowing with reporters, other victims' families, and local townspeople who had once doubted that such profound evil could exist in their quiet, beautiful mountains. The trial, a grueling, emotionally draining ordeal, stretched for months, each agonizing day bringing more revelations.
Every intimate, horrifying detail of Brianna and Dylan's final hours was meticulously dissected, laid bare before a jury, a testament to the enduring power of a sister's love and a community's quest for truth. Forensic evidence painted a chilling, undeniable picture. Bloodstains, meticulously matched to the broken jewelry chain found in the gang's possession, spoke volumes of a violent struggle. The re-examined phone records definitively placed the devices within the confines of the crumbling farmhouse, but it was the witness testimony from the rescued couple that delivered the final, crushing blow, their voices trembling with the lingering trauma as they recounted overhearing the killers argue about the mother and the boy who wouldn't give up the locket. Each day in court was an agonizing ordeal for Brianna's sister. She sat stoically in the gallery, her heart shredding as lawyers clinically described the brutal reality, how Brianna had been struck down, how Dylan, in a final act of filial courage, had fought back with all his youthful strength, and how both had ultimately fallen against unforgiving rocks, bleeding to death within minutes. It was not a swift disappearance, not a merciful vanishing into the mist. It was a desperate, terrifying fight for survival that ended in horrific violence and overwhelming fear. Tears rolled silently down her cheeks as she listened, clutching a crumpled tissue in one hand and a rosary worn smooth by countless prayers in the other. But she refused to look away. She wanted the men to see her face, to know that she carried the full, crushing weight of Brianna and Dylan's memory into that very courtroom, an unyielding sentinel of their lost lives. The defense, clinging to any thread of doubt, attempted to spin the story as a robbery gone wrong, a tragic accident, a case of poor judgment rather than intentional murder. But the jury saw through the thinly veiled deception. The deliberate sealing of the septic chamber, the meticulous hiding of the bodies, the cold possession of the stolen items, all pointed to a calculated, cold-blooded deliberation. After weeks of harrowing testimony, the verdict finally came back, guilty on all counts. The Colo Kings were sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the judge delivered the sentence, Brianna's sister closed her eyes, a silent prayer escaping her lips. "For you, Brianna. For you, Dylan." It was not a moment of triumph. There was no joy, no celebratory exultation in the hushed courtroom. Justice, in this agonizing case, was a cold, hard substitute for the vibrant lives that had been brutally extinguished. But it was something, a promise fulfilled, a truth finally, irrevocably uncovered. In the months that followed, the community rallied around Brianna and Dylan's memory. A memorial was lovingly erected at the trailhead near the cabin where they had last been seen, a silent testament to their vibrant spirits. Locals left fresh flowers and flickering candles, small tokens of remembrance. Hikers stopped to read the plaque that bore their names, their steps hushed, their thoughts somber. And her sister visited often, standing in the quiet woods where laughter had once echoed, tracing the carved words with her fingers, imagining her sister walking beside her, Dylan laughing ahead on the sun-dappled trail. Yet, despite the closure, the grief lingered, a persistent, dull ache in her soul. Nights were still restless, haunted by shadows. Sometimes her sister would replay Brianna's last WhatsApp voice message, the one sent at noon on that final ordinary day. "We'll be leaving around 4. Call me when you can." She would play it over and over, her tears falling as she realized how ordinary the words were, how utterly unaware Brianna and her son were, just hours away from their unimaginable tragedy. That single, unassuming message had become a haunting relic, a poignant reminder of everything lost in the blink of an eye. The case also sparked broader, vital changes. Law enforcement agencies across the region increased their coordination for missing persons, investing in better digital tracking technologies and robust cross-agency databases, determined that such a tragic disappearance would not go unsolved again. For many, Brianna and Dylan's story became a cautionary tale about the insidious dangers that can hide even in the most familiar, tranquil places. But for her sister, the lessons meant little compared to the gaping hole left behind. They were more than victims, she told a reporter once, her voice firm. They were people who loved, who laughed, who lived. I want them remembered as more than just a headline. On the 3rd anniversary of the discovery of their bodies, Brianna's sister stood at the memorial once again. The sun dipped behind the mountains, painting the sky in soft, ethereal hues of orange and purple. She placed fresh flowers beneath the plaque, their petals soft against the cold stone, and whispered into the quiet air, "You're not lost anymore. You're home now." For the first time in years, she allowed herself a small, fragile smile through the tears. The agonizing fight was over. The terrible truth had been found. And though the ache of their absence would never fully fade, she knew with a quiet certainty that Brianna and Dylan's story would never, ever be forgotten.